Okay, good evening. Welcome to this presentation of the Transformative Vision Speaker Series, a Niagara University presidential initiative in which we host visionaries who have imagined and struggled to create a just future. My name is Dave Riley. I am the chair of the Department of Political Science and Director of International Studies here at Niagara. And thank you to the audience for joining us tonight. This series was imagined and developed by University President Father Muir, who has challenged us to think more deeply about the issues that receive inadequate treatment in presidential campaigning. Our speakers have been invited to offer a vision of America and the world that transcends many of our current challenges and limitations through bold leadership and action. The series began a few weeks back with Dr. Wayne Frederick, who discussed the future of health policy and the intersection of race and healthcare. That was followed by a fireside chat with former Chief of Staff to Barack Obama, Dennis McDonough, who spoke on the inner workings of the White House, policymaking, and the people who serve at the core of American government. Tonight, we are fortunate to be joined by Dina Gilio-Whitaker, who will present on environmental justice in Indian country and moving toward a transformational land ethic. This semester's presentations will conclude on November 17th with Sophia Elijah presenting on criminal justice and policing reform. Each of these presentations center on a key observation. As the 2020 US presidential election approaches, just a couple of days away, the major party candidates have attempted to define the issues and, for better or worse, to offer a vision of how they would seek to transform America and the world. Historically, however, campaign promises are thwarted, diluted, or ignored, failing in ways both large and small to alter the status quo. And increasingly, American presidential campaigns are understood by all participants as vacuous, uninspiring exercises in the manipulation of consumer behavior. And in the contemporary entertainment media technology complex, the ideals of equality, reasoned deliberation, and participatory democracy are sacrificed at the altar of corporate greed. As election day approaches, we can expect to see and hear bold statements about the defining issues of our time and the power of the people to chart our future course. We believe here at Niagara that a fundamentally different approach is needed. The challenges facing America and the world are complex, magnitudinous, and recalcitrant to simple solutions. Our students, and indeed all persons living today, need the tools to understand racial inequality, police violence, mass incarceration, civil rights, Black Lives Matter, reparations, access to healthcare, inequities in health outcomes, the COVID-19 pandemic, environmental degradation, catastrophic climate change, the global refugee crisis, immigration, the sexual assault pandemic, sexual harassment, #MeToo, LGBTQ discrimination, and so many more. Niagara University's Transformative Vision series is intended to offer our students and our community a model of inquiry, discourse, imagination, and action. As we draw our inspiration from St. Vincent de Paul, who organized his contemporaries to respond compassionately to people's basic human needs, we hope that this series inspires participants to serve all members of society, especially the poor and oppressed, in communities and in the larger world. At this point, I'd like to turn to Dr. Rory Quigley, Niagara University's Assistant to the Provost for Graduate Programs. Dr. Quigley is a member of the Seneca Nation, Chairwoman of the Board of Directors of the Seneca Resorts and Casinos, and a strong advocate for Native issues. She will introduce tonight's presenter. So thank you, Dr. Quigley.
Thank you, Dr. Riley. And as an enrolled citizen of the Seneca Nation, I first ask that you join me in acknowledging that as we gather this evening, whether you've joined us from your home or somewhere on the Niagara University campus, that we stand on ancestral lands of the Seneca and other Indigenous communities who stewarded this land throughout generations. In doing so, we honor the sovereignty of the Haudenosaunee or Six Nations people as a means to demonstrate respect and correct the stories and practices that erase Indigenous people's history and culture by inviting and honoring truth. I hope that my colleagues and our students at Niagara University believe that truth and recognition are critical components to building connections across all barriers of heritage and differences. Let us offer land acknowledgement as a part of the conscious effort to affirm our commitment to be better stewards of the land on which we stand, and to pledge to work in partnership with a spirit of reconciliation, mutual respect, and collaboration as we appreciate and regard the traditions of the diverse cultures that comprise our campus community. In preparation for tonight's event, I had the honor of a personal conversation with our guest speaker, something I'm sure the two of us would have enjoyed even more if tonight's presidential speaker series were live and in person on campus. Regardless, during our conversation, I realized that we live a shared history as our respective families and communities have been impacted by remnants of an era in US history in which American Indian children were displaced from their families and homes and placed in residential boarding schools in an attempt to assimilate the Indigenous peoples of this land. In our conversation, I believe we each came to the realization that what generations before us experienced has both impacted and changed our lives. So, formally, please allow me to give you a little bit of information about Dina Gilio-Whitaker. She's a member of the Colville Confederated Tribe, which is located in the northeastern part of what is now the state of Washington. Dina currently serves as a lecturer of American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and is an independent consultant and educator in environmental justice policy planning. Having worked in an Indigenous research organization for several years, Dina came into teaching in higher education just recently. Dina considers herself fortunate as she's able to teach courses on environmentalism and American Indians, traditional ecological knowledge, religion and philosophy, Native women's activism, American Indians and sports, and decolonization, all in addition to working with colleagues who share a common philosophy about what they teach, as well as their pedagogical approaches. Dina also works within the field of critical sports studies, examining the intersections of indigeneity and the sport of surfing. As a public intellectual, Dina brings her scholarship into focus as an award-winning journalist as well, contributing to numerous online outlets, including Indian Country Today, the Los Angeles Times, High Country News, and many more. Dina is the author of 2 books, the most recent one entitled As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. And she is currently under contract with Beacon Press for a new book under the working title, Illegitimate Nation, Confronting Settler Privilege and Moving Toward a Transformational Land Ethic. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming tonight's guest speaker, Dina Gilio-Whitaker.
Thank you, Dr. Quigley and Dr. Riley. Before I start, I'd like to do a reality check on time and see how much time I have so I don't go over and are we doing allowing time for Q&A?
Yes, so if you want to speak for anywhere in the vicinity of 45 minutes to an hour, that would be great.
Okay, and then we'll allow some time for Q&A after that.
Perfect.
Yeah, perfect. Awesome. That's my favorite part. Why Pisnaxio Ku Isquis Dina Gilio-Whitaker. And as Dr. Quigley said, I'm a member, descendant of the Colville Confederated Tribes in Washington State, the Sinixt Band. But I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded homelands of the Ohashiman Nation in what is considered currently Orange County in the state of California. So that's where I currently live. And I teach at San Marcos, which is in the San Diego County, just south of where I'm living right now. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for this PowerPoint that I have for you. Let's see. And There we go. Let's do that. Okay. So as was already stated, the topic of this talk is environmental justice in Indian country and moving toward a transformational land ethic. So really what I'm doing is I'm combining the work from my book that's currently out, the environmental justice book, As Long as Grass Grows, combining it into the topic of the my forthcoming book with Beacon Press on settler privilege and a transformational land ethic, because it flows, the one flows out of the other, and hopefully that will be obvious as I move forward here. But I wanted to share with you the image. The painting here is the original painting that became the image for the cover of As Long as Grass Grows, and I love it so much. It was painted by, it's a ledger style art painting, very particular type of art modality in the Indian art world. And it was done by an old friend of mine. His name is Michael Horse, and he's a very well-known Native artist and actor. And I've known him for a long, long time. And I've always had this dream that someday I would write a book and he would do a painting for it. And so I asked him if he would do that for this book. And it just came out, it was so perfect that I love it so much that I want to share it. And as you'll see here, this is how it looks. This is how the finished product came out. And I'm just, they say you can't judge a book by its cover, but I think sometimes you can. And I personally love the way this looks. But I want to start by sort of giving you a grounding in what this book is about and how it came about. In this book, what I do is I look at the concept of environmental justice. Now, environmental justice is understood, it's really a discourse, and it includes a lot of different elements, you would say, like environmental justice is activism. It's also theory, and it's policy and law. And so it's all of these things that we can mean different things when we say that term environmental justice. And in the academic world, the way we understand this concept of environmental justice, at the core of it is this concept known as environmental racism. This has been it's very well established. We have not even had the concept of environmental injustice and justice is really it's not that old. It really only begins around the early 1980s, and it comes out of the Deep South, out of Black communities in the Deep South, fighting against the intentional siting of toxic waste dumps in their communities. And so they said that, we're targeted because we're targeted for these noxious facilities because we're Black and we're powerless and we're poor. And so they called that environmental racism, and it worked. And so all of, the early literature talked about, the earliest studies, in fact, made that argument. And, it turned out to be, there was plenty of evidence for this thing called environmental racism. So this concept of environmental racism, it centers race as kind of the analytic lens that you look at this type of injustice through, and it works. But for me, when I was studying environmental justice, I've always been drawn to environmentalism. I've been considering myself an environmental activist since the early 1980s. And that was way before I went back to school and got some degrees and, started thinking about this stuff on this kind of scholarly level. But when I was as an undergrad, I was in an American Indian Studies program at the University of New Mexico. And I took my first environmental justice class, and I discovered that, and this is probably 15 years ago now. And when I was in that class, the literature was sort of cobbled together, and there wasn't a real strong, there was almost no literature written by Indigenous or Native American studies people. And it didn't include the topics that I understood at the core of like an environment, like a Native American studies methodology. So largely we were absent in that literature, and I found that very deeply unsatisfying. And then I got into grad school, and I took another environmental justice class, an entirely different department in the American Studies department, and in that class, I saw no Native perspectives, not even any. We weren't reading any Native authors at all, and so we were completely erased. You know, I mean, erasure is one of the things that sort of defines who we are in the settler state. And there was almost nothing. There was nothing. We weren't reading anything relative to our realities. So I set out to understand, what does environmental justice theory look like when American Indian people are centered? And so I wrote a master's thesis on it. And that's really where this book comes from. There's that's the origin of it. And so in that study, in that thesis, and in this book, what I argue is that for American Indians, talking about environmental justice must begin with the history of invasion, genocide, and land theft, and what we call settler colonialism. And that unless it attends to these histories, it can never be responsive to us. It will never really fit. Environmental justice and the way we think about environmental justice just won't work. And it also must acknowledge the political difference of American Indians. So American Indians as nations with the political relationship to the state, we are not ethnic minorities. And that's one of the first things I was taught in American Indian studies was, we are not ethnic minorities. We have this political nation-to-nation relationship with the state. And so unless environmental justice theory can account for that, then it doesn't mean anything to us. So, and there are some other things too, and I'll get to that in a minute. So what do we mean when we say settler colonialism? What are we talking about? We're talking about this concept that American Indian Studies, really works from. I mean, this is how American Indian Studies emerges from. Really, it centers around this concept, and it's pretty widely accepted at this point. It's not just post-colonial studies, right? We don't fit in that because there is, for us, no post and post-colonial. And that's the distinction, is that settler colonialism is seen as a structure. It's something that's ongoing, like it never ends, because of the structure, I'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to share this image. I think we're all really familiar with this image, the image that sort of embodies the concept of manifest destiny. And this is the quintessential representation of that, with the angelic looking Columbia, and Columbia is, spreading, she's emerged, she's coming from the east and she's heading west, and she's not really an angel, but she's sort of angelic looking. And, she has a book in her hand, and it looks kind of like, you might think it's a Bible, but it's not really a Bible. It actually says education on it. And she's got with her, she's stringing this wire. And so the wire is presumably a telegraph wire. So there's this element of technology that she's bringing. She's bringing the light of education and the light of technology as she sweeps across the land, in partnership or, together in parallel with, the intrepid pioneers and the railroad. And in the background, you see, these boats and these urbanizing land spaces. And then in the foreground, or to the left, to the west, of course, is darkness. And she's chasing out the darkness. And who represents the darkness? no better than the Indians who are running away from that, and the buffalo, or, they're all fading into the darkness as the light sweeps across the land. This is what we're all conditioned to think. This is the perfect visual message of the typical American narrative. And so in this narrative, what we are told is that Europeans and Euro-American centrism here is, and their knowledge is superior to Indigenous knowledge and to Indigenous people. Indigenous people are, the backwards. They represent, cultures that are doomed to fade away, doomed to die, and so all of this is bound up with religion, and because why? Because manifest destiny. If we think about manifest destiny, embodied in that is all about these narratives of divine guidance or divine inspiration. This is meant by God. It was meant by God for Americans to spread out west and take the land, and it's their divine right and inheritance, and that all of this gets bound up. It's a very big conversation. It goes back to the Roman Catholic Church and the papal bulls of the 15th century. These, before Europeans even set foot on this continent, they had this whole plan worked out through these series of papal bulls that ultimately legitimize the violent takeover of the lands based on Christianity, based on the fact that when they get to the lands that they haven't been to yet, but they know they're going to get there and they're going to find people there. And when they get there, they know they're not going to be Christians. And so they construct this whole narrative about when they do get there, and because they are obligated to spread the word of God, they have divine right and title to the land. This is the history. And it all gets coded into the legal system, beginning with the first Supreme Court decision related to Indians, which is known as Johnson v. Macintosh in 1823, and what became and still is known as the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is the foundation of federal Indian law today. And so you have this hugely problematic, entanglement of religion and constructing Indigenous peoples and as inferior because they're not Christian. So this is the actual foundation of federal Indian law in this country, which is why we say that it's still a structure. So that the colonialism is a structure that continues to shape the lands and lives of Native people. So it's very paternalistic, it's very hegemonic. This relationship, it's not, we talk about sovereignty, but it's not actual sovereignty. It's only semi-sovereignty, and it's sovereignty almost in name only. And so when we talk about privilege, we're kind of used to hearing conversations in racial justice circles around white privilege, right? And we're sort of, especially recently, with the ethnic uprisings of this year, we hear this, been hearing a lot about white privilege, and so it's said, and it centers race as that which determines privilege. But for American Indians, it's different, and that's some of the arguments I'm making in the new book. It's really not accurate. It's not as accurate to say, to talk about racism in this hegemonic paternalistic relationship toward American Indians. It's really more accurate to say settler privilege, because for Native Americans, it always begins with the land. It always begins with genocide, the killing of our ancestors for the taking of land. And that's that settler reality. Okay. So what that, you know, the idea of manifest destiny and what that painting represents is it's really a part of the narrative of that is, you know, the narrative of progress. It's progress and modernity. And as, you know, European Americans flood westward in these exploding populations, bringing all this technology and the Industrial Revolution, you know, it's said to bring, you know, the modern world and bringing the land, you know, the taming of the land, the taming of the West, all these kind of euphemisms that we have in this country to describe these processes. And but from an American Indian perspective, it's not that at all. It's something completely opposite. It's that while this new technology is sweeping across the land, making the, you know, the condition of possibility for European populations. What it's doing for Indigenous people is it's robbing them of their rights, of not just their rights, but their ability to exist as Native people on the land. It comes with the actual physical killing of them, number one, but it also comes with the environmental disruption so profound that they become, their ways of life become completely negated and endangered. And we call this, it's because of this remaking of the land, and we call this ecocide. This term ecocide combines the word like ecosystem or ecology with the word genocide, and it brings those two processes together because one doesn't happen without the other for Native people. The ways to illustrate that are these images here. In the upper left here is an image of the Missouri River watershed. This is the territory of the Great Sioux Nation, which is now broken up into 7 separate reservations. It was at one time one gigantic reservation of the Great Sioux Nation, but through the processes of history, it was carved up and completely shrunk, and, you know, became a big land grab, especially during the Dawes years of the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so what we're looking at here is and this is how it relates to Standing Rock. The Standing Rock conflict from a few years ago was the Pick-Sloan Act of 1944 was a land water reclamation project to accomplish flood control, to build dams to control floods, to create these lakes that would then, you know, enable large-scale agriculture. And Lake Oahe, which was at the center of that controversy at Standing Rock, what the Standing Rock tribe was trying to prevent an oil pipeline from going underneath that lake itself and all of those lakes were part of this ecocidal process in the mid 20th century that cut Sioux, you know, Lakota Sioux people off from their abilities to really take care of themselves on the land because of the flooding of territory. So you have the loss of village sites, you have the loss of plant medicines, you have the loss of timber, the loss of food plants. So all of these things, you know, create this massive environmental disruption for them. And displaces them. It becomes the probably the most in terms of environmental causes of displacement. This probably is the biggest compared to and this is a comparison here. In this image here is a image of the Columbia River watershed. That's where I'm from. This is the land of my ancestors. The Colville Reservation is here. So this entire region is the Columbia River and the tributaries of it. whereas the Missouri River only had 5 dams built on it, and it caused this massive displacement of thousands of Native people. The Columbia River, on the other hand, has over 60 dams built on it, and it didn't displace that many Native people, but what it did was it completely interfered with their cultures, and cultures built around their relationship to salmon and other species, but predominantly salmon. And so the damming of the Columbia River represents this massive environmental catastrophe that's ongoing to the point where we have, completely endangered the ability of salmon to perpetuate itself. So, and salmon being a keystone species means that when you have the collapse of a keystone species, it leads to the collapse of other species. So it's an environmental catastrophe that's playing out in this region. And that's not the only one, but this is, it's particularly known for that. Now, other ecocidal processes are illustrated by this image here, which is the Colorado Plateau. And this is an image of uranium mining and the impact that uranium mining since the 1930s has had, particularly in the Southwest. And this is something that I write about in the book. And this has to this day has ongoing detrimental impacts to Navajo and Pueblo peoples because of this, dramatic history of uranium mining and the abandoning of these mines. There are over 1,000 of these abandoned uranium mines in the region that continue to contaminate the land and water and air of these people. And so they have elevated rates of cancers, lung cancers and other kinds of respiratory illnesses and things like that. And so it's been called slow death. It's like slow genocide through the continual contamination of the land of these native homelands. So the point is that while we have these narratives of progress and modernity with technology, it's ecocide and the slow death of Indigenous people. I also write about, so I'm giving you kind of like the highlights of what I'm writing about, what I've written about in this book, and the kinds of things that we need to think about environmental justice discourse relative to Native peoples that has not really been framed in that way. I also do a pretty hard look at the environmental movement and the environmental movement's history of in its role in these genocidal processes. So even though I said earlier that this racial lens is inappropriate for framing Indigenous issues, white supremacy is still nonetheless a reality. And the beginning of the environmental movement is all bound up with this white supremacy, this white European cultural supremacy. And we look at that. The what's sometimes called the proto-environmental movement is with the conservation and preservation movements, which we can trace back to the 1870s with the creation of the national park system. And the early writings, that was very much influenced by some of the thinkers of the time, which were people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who were contemporaries of each other and very influenced. Thoreau was very influenced by Emerson, and then Muir was very influenced by Thoreau. Thoreau, though, is considered this hero in the environmental movement, kind of one of the patron saints of the environmental movement. And Thoreau, he's been written about a lot, and he's even been written about for his, but sort of, supposedly benevolent views about American Indians. He was pretty obsessed with American Indians and wrote about them a lot. He has a whole book called The Maine Woods, where he writes about his friendship with two Penobscot Indians and what he learns from them. And he wrote a lot in both published and unpublished manuscripts about Native people, so that show what I call a fetishization. He was fixated on Indian people, and because he thought that they've lived on the land in appropriate ways that could be learned from, but the thing is like, even though he wrote about that and he seemed to believe that, ultimately he was a man of his times, and though in those times it also coincides with the beginning of the anthropology as an academic discipline, and what we call today social Darwinism. And social Darwinism was about these ideas of human civilizations and evolution, where some people were seen to be in higher states of civilization, right? And it's always white Europeans who are at the pinnacle of civilization, and everybody else was somewhere below that in some form of evolution, to aspire to this high exalted state of civilization. Native people and Black people were always at the bottom of that pyramid. And so Thoreau really bought into that. He really believed ultimately that Native people, even though he loved them and he respected the way they lived on the land, he believed that because they weren't Christians, they were ultimately doomed to fade away. And so that's just one example of how all of this gets baked into the early environmental movement through conservationists. And it also is paralleling the federal Indian policy of the time, which was very aggressive. The federal government was aggressively pursuing these treaties that were about chasing Native people off their lands. So you have this, at this time, this anxiety, this collective anxiety about urbanization in the East. And as people are moving west, they're looking at the wild spaces and, understand that there's all these very highly romanticized aspects to this about the West and, and settling the West and the open frontiers and all of that stuff that are so, embedded in our cultural landscape. All of this is inseparable. So, but at the same time, the federal government is chasing Indians off their lands, and there's people are Mark David Spence. I'm very influenced by his work. I'm going to hold on. Hold on a second. Hey, you guys, I'm doing it. Okay, so Mark David Spence in his groundbreaking book called Dispossessing the Wilderness talks about how he looks at the beginning of the national park systems, especially Yellowstone, Glacier, and Yosemite. And he says that he talks about how the philosophies of building these national parks was based on these wonderland, these natural wonderlands, and this idea of wilderness, and wilderness as being free of humans. And he says that the problem with that is that while they're pursuing this project to protect the wilderness first has to be created. And that's what he's talking about how the federal government is chasing Native people off the land in order to create these parks. And so the environmental movement begins with all of this. And so I look at that, and of course, John Muir, we hear a lot about John Muir in the last couple of months with the Sierra Club, distancing itself from him because of his, widely known racist worldviews, which he was very well known to be pretty racist against Native people too. And he comes to California in 1868, and in 1868, California is in an open campaign to exterminate the Native population. It's policy, it's state policy, and it's funded by the federal government. This is what's happening, and he never opposes it. He's all for getting rid of the Indians out of Yosemite Valley. So this is the beginning of the environmental movement, and it carries through the 20th century, and that's what I look at in the book. And I have this image here that I came across recently that I'd never seen before. This book cover of called this problematic title called "The New Pioneers," and it's about the Back to the Land movement and the search for a sustainable future. But it's so unconscious of the tropes that they're regurgitating here, that they're reinforcing about the rugged pioneers, and all of that means in terms of running Native peoples off their lands in these very genocidal histories. There's still a lack of awareness in this. Of course, the cultural appropriation that came with it, with the Back to the Land movement, the teepee, is a perfect symbol of that. The Back to the Landers buying up big tracts of land and building teepees and living on teepees, and taking on the appearance of Indians. All of this is connected to this very racist history, this very genocidal history. So I want to shift gears a little bit here now and talk about Indigenous knowledge and how Indigenous knowledge comes into play when we're talking about Native people's relationship to the land. Native people, Indigenous relationship to the land is very different than settler society's relationship to the land. And that's why Native people lived on the land sustainably for thousands of years, right? They understood how to live within the limits of an ecosystem, of various ecosystems. And this is what, builds what are ultimately sustainable societies. And but it's not just like, sometimes the word wisdom, like Native wisdom or Native folklore, and Native mythologies, like these words get used to convey something that is not quite science. It's not quite knowledge. And it's not quite legitimate knowledge. It's romanticized. But Indigenous knowledge systems are what Native scholars call epistemologies, or cultural epistemologies that are based on thousands of years of experience living in ecosystems. And so these knowledge systems, there's not one monolithic, one Indigenous knowledge, but there are many Indigenous knowledges because they emerge from their relationships to land and place and ecosystems. And traditional ecological knowledge is one type of environmental knowledge. And the thing to understand about it is that traditional ecological knowledge is not just theoretical knowledge. It's not just something where Native people say we think something is true. It's based on some kind of experiment or replication. It's knowledge based on thousands of years of experience, of observation, of living within those systems. And so It's applied knowledge. That's what ecological knowledge is applied knowledge. And I want to show you an example of it. And I have a video that is just 4 minutes long, but it'll give you a really beautiful example of what applied Indigenous knowledge looks like.
This forest is about to go up in...
Whoops. Here we go.
This forest is...
Hey.
This forest is about to go up in flames. Don't worry, it's intentional. We're here in Roslyn, Washington at a prescribed burn, and it's actually supposed to make the forest more resistant to fires because these woods have been really unhealthy. Think of a prescribed burn as a vaccination against really, really bad fires. And just like giving out shots, you need people who know what they're doing.
This is like the main tool of prescribed fire. You get a little bit of a arm workout.
Oh, yes. Today, prescribed burning is showing up more and more in state forest management policies. Why? Because wildfires are way worse than they used to be. A century of poor forest management and fire suppression has created a lot of fuel to burn. All that underbrush acts like kindling. Climate change leads to hotter temperatures and longer dry periods, which create perfect conditions for a wildfire to start. Put all that together and you have the makings of a disaster. Today's wildfires can even take out big old growth trees that have historically been able to stand up to wildfire. Take this piece of ponderosa pine that's been around for over 2 centuries. This cross-section of a tree trunk is about to teach us a bunch of history, so show some respect and pay attention. Before European settlers arrived, Native American tribes in the Western US were already forest management experts. Many Native peoples embraced fire as part of certain ecosystems. In fact, many trees in the West, like ponderosa pines and giant sequoias, are made healthier by regular human-managed fire. The Yakama Nation used prescribed burning to keep the forests healthy and to cultivate different resources they depended on, like berry plants. But when colonists showed up, it didn't occur to them that the forests were so impressive and the timber so strong because they'd been taken care of by humans.
I mean, they were very colorful responses. In some instances, they're just burning things up. They would also notice these abundant berry fields, and they wouldn't always make the connection.
In 1910, there was a massive wildfire that spread across Montana, Idaho, and Washington. As a result, the federal government was like, we've got to take better care of these forests. Time for a Forest Service. Up until that point, there had been some debate over prescribed burning. But the new agency imposed a hard and fast fire suppression policy. No burning, no exceptions. Traditional burning was outlawed, and tribal members were punished for practicing it. And it turns out that was not the best way to keep forests healthy. It was also really culturally oppressive.
Preventing fires was another way of directly reducing native influence within their ancestral territories.
And forests that had been managed by humans for thousands of years were suddenly growing wild and unchecked. So that's basically how we end up here, in a period of time that's warmer than ever before in recorded history, with a whole lot of very unruly forests. Around the 1970s, some ecologists started to point out that suppressing fire in forests was actually making wildfire damage worse. And that way of thinking has gotten more and more traction.
2014, we had a record wildfire year. In 2015, we broke that record. I think people were, what are all the tools in the toolbox? How do we protect ourselves? How do we make our forests more healthy?
In 2017, the state of Washington made prescribed burns central to its 20-year fire management plan.
We obviously are inheriting a problem that's been over 50 years in the making. It's going to take us a while to get on top of it, but we are going to make a significant difference in restoring the health of our forests, and it will include prescribed fire.
Which brings us full circle, working with fire instead of suppressing it, a practice that's still alive in many tribal cultures today.
What we're really looking at is a group of people that have been able to survive for thousands of years based on their relationship, interaction, and management with resources. I don't feel like you're going to have a very efficient project in today's world ignoring a thousands-year-old data set.
Okay.
This forest is about to...
There we go. Okay. So I love that little video. I was actually a consultant on that little video, and I was really pleased with the way it came out. because it shows, how important Indigenous knowledge is, and how, we've gotten to the point where we're at, especially in the West, by suppressing Indigenous knowledge. And so Indigenous knowledge has to be part of environmental justice discourse when we're talking about what environmental justice means. So how do we decolonize environmental justice? My argument is that all this discourse of environmental justice must recognize this history of ongoing settler colonialism and the structures that it creates in this hegemonic paternalistic relationship with American Indian nations. And go beyond this concept of race. This is very problematic for us, being referred to as a race, because there are conservative forces right now that are trying to dismantle our sovereignty based on their argument that Native peoples are getting preferential treatment because we're a race. And of course, that's constitutional. So there's actually a case headed to the Supreme Court that they hope will get there, where they can make that argument. And if it's called the Brackeen case, and if that happens, it will very potentially lead to the dismantling of the entire system of recognition of whatever sovereignty we do have. Okay, so that's why we need to get away from this concept of race and emphasize nationhood. It needs to recognize, decolonizing environmental justice needs to recognize Indigenous people's different relationship to land based on these different epistemologies and ontologies. And the world arguably has a lot to learn from that. It also needs to recognize the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is about free, prior, and informed consent, which is what the Declaration enshrines, this right to consent of development that happens on Indigenous lands. But even though the US has supposedly endorsed that agreement, they don't enforce it. And they only privilege consultation. But consultation is where like Standing Rock went wrong. That's why we had consultation. That's why Standing Rock, the debacle of Standing Rock happened, was ultimately because there wasn't adequate consultation with the Standing Rock Sioux. And so we have to have recognition of Indigenous knowledge systems too. Okay, so where is this leading? All of this is leading to me in this new work that I'm doing, on thinking through, what does it mean to have a land ethic? What does it mean? Because Native people have a land ethic. We've always had a land ethic. That's what Indigenous knowledge is. It's an ethical relationship to land. Aldo Leopold, wrote, for those of you who might be environmental humanities people, he famously wrote this essay called The Land Ethic in the posthumously published book, The Sand County Almanac, where he talked about this, how Americans need to have this different relationship to the environmental or to the natural world, that wasn't based on, exploitation and extraction, but that respected the natural world. And, he gets celebrated as being, like a visionary. And, it was really, at the time, it was revolutionary for him to think that and to say that. And so there's this entire body of environmentalism that upholds Aldo Leopold and his work and his writings around this. At the same time, we have N. Scott Momaday, who is a celebrated Native Kiowa writer, a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, and he wrote an essay called An American Land Ethic also, but in 1997, although he wrote it originally in 1970. I just found that out recently. But so he writes about a land ethic, but he writes that, from a Kiowa perspective, Kiowa people, American Indians, have always had this land ethic. And and he's saying that, you know, all Americans can learn from that. And so I'm bringing these two together in conversation and saying, yes, they are both right. And until there is a reckoning, until there's in the United States a reckoning with this violent history, this genocidal history, and the displacing of Indian people from their land, these profound histories of injustice, until that's accounted for, then there will be no possibility for a land ethic that will be a just and land ethic for American Indian people. And so that's where I'm going with it in the new book. And you know, that's all bound up with Indigenous knowledge, and how Indigenous knowledge needs to be a foundation for how we imagine a sustainable future. If we are to have one, this is ultimately, in my view, it's ultimately not just a problem of science or a problem of economics. It's a problem of philosophy, ultimately. And that's where I'm going with it. So that's my last slide. And I hope this has been thought-provoking for you, and that you have some questions that you'd like to ask. And maybe somebody, Dave, will moderate that.
I will. Yes, thank you so much. Really interesting, and having read your book, I think you've added some elements and really brought in some different pieces that are fascinating. What I'll ask of the audience is that you either pose a question in the chat or in the Q&A, and then we'll elevate you to a panelist status so that we can see you and you can ask the question directly, or simply raise your hand using that function. And while that's happening, let me, if I can, ask the first question, which is the role of feminism that was lost from Indigenous knowledge. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, it's obvious that the process of exploitation and domination was a very male-centric process, and a very aggressive. But we know a little less, I think, about what was lost in terms of some of the knowledge and the different perspectives on feminism. Could you talk about that?
Well, I would say, first of all, that it's not lost. I would say that it was eroded. You know, it was for sure eroded, and in many cases, you know, I wouldn't say lost. I would say that you know, those knowledges are still there. They're maybe not all the way intact, but. And thank you for bringing that up, because that's a chapter in the book that I wrote about the importance of women's knowledge, and how women were so central to these Indigenous epistemologies and these pedagogies, really. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, the way Native societies educated their people and their children. So, and the Native women had, you know, pretty much, I mean, you know, there's a kind of a debate around, you know, what constitutes matriarchy, right? Matriarchal cultures. And we have these other terms called matrilineal and matrifocal, and they have different kinds of nuances. But I prefer the term gender equitable, to say that Native societies were by and large gender equitable. And in some Native societies, women had very highly, a lot of power, like political power. And that's especially true in Haudenosaunee, you know, in that territory where you're at. Haudenosaunee people, you know, women's traditions are, you know, a very, very important example of how Native women, you know, were looked to and respected in those traditions, in those societies. And there's a whole history about Native women being in activism, Native women's activism in the 20th century that's happening while the men are getting the attention. I'm talking about the Red Power movement here at this point, during the 1960s and 1970s, while in the American Indian movement, while the men are at the mic and getting all the attention, the women are bringing out studying the issues of environmental contamination, because in certain places like South Dakota, who are also dealing with the problems of contamination from uranium mining, it's poisoning their water, women are having disproportionate rates of miscarriages, of birth defects, and other kinds of illnesses that are reproductive issues. And so all of this gets bound up into that activism of the 1970s. And that's a really important point to keep in mind, that Native women. And so now, Native women are, keeping this leadership going. And we're finally, that was something that was really, with the Standing Rock conflict, that was something that was so stunning and so visible, because it was a movement led by women and youth. And so finally we're reclaiming that, and there's a kind of renewed respect for that, I think.
Great, thank you very much. And I did notice that Rory Quigley, Dr. Quigley, added a comment in there that there's a documentary on Haudenosaunee women's influence airing on PBS on November 2nd. So very relevant information. Did you want to talk to that point, Rory?
Well, a good friend of mine, Junie Fox from Akwesasne up in Mohawk Territory, basically got a clan mother together along with Sally Roche Wagner, who actually published a book on the Haudenosaunee women's influence on the women's suffragist movement. And I collaborated on the documentary called Without a Whisper. And we are very fortunate that it is airing on Monday, November 2nd on PBS. So if you could all take a look for it, that would be great. And it's Without a Whisper. So.
Oh, that's so good to know. I'm so happy to know. I had not heard about that. I've been very influenced by Sally Roche Wagner's work. And I teach a course on Native women's activism, and I start the class off with her work, and which of course is drawing from Haudenosaunee women's leadership. Thank you.
So we have a question from David Whalen. If we could promote him to panelist so he can ask his question. Are you there, David?
I'm here. Yes. Yeah. Okay. I put in just recognizing that you cross borders. Your people cross into Canada. I noticed on your map, and obviously the intentions are the same. What is the differences specific to Canada and the U.S. and how does that affect your drive, your movement to address the injustices?
I'm not sure I'm understanding your question, but there's a way that I can answer that. That's very personal and very close to home, because the Colville Confederated Tribes, our reservation, when it was first created, it extended all the way to the Canadian border, and then the federal government in the early 1900s did one of their land grabs and reduced the size of our reservation by half. Our tribe, the Colville Confederated Tribes, is 12 bands and tribes. One of the bands is called the Sinixt Band, and I'm of that band. And so as Sinixt people, we were from above the Canadian border in the area known today as the Arrow Lakes. So the Canadian history is as brutal toward Indigenous peoples as American history was, and its processes of dispossessing Native people. In that history, what happened was that Sinixt people whose homelands were the Arrow Lakes up there were pretty much chased out, and they ended up on the Colville Reservation. Meanwhile, the Canadian government declared Sinixt people extinct in 1956. So even though there's people, and they're still there in Canada, but the Canadian government says they're extinct, and they all moved to the Colville Reservation. So that what that means is that they've negated their any hunting rights, any rights to the land, to hunt and fish on the land. So there's been our Sinixt people in our tribe have been challenging that. We want access to our ancestral homelands. Those are our homelands. Our ancestors are buried there. That's our place of origin that the Canadian government will not allow us access to. And so there's been this legal case going through for the last 10 years. One of our members intentionally brought a case to the Canadian government to challenge that history. And so that in order to gain rights to our territory. And so this is an orchestrated legal challenge. We just 2 weeks ago, we've made it all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court. All of the lower courts have decided favorably for us, saying that yes, the Sinixt people still exist, and yes, you do still have rights to those territories, to hunt and fish in those territories. And so now we're just waiting for word from the Canadian government, from the Canadian Supreme Court. And if we get a favorable ruling from the Supreme Court, the legal analysis is saying that it has the potential to have very wide range impacts in the United States and Canada in Indian law. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but it certainly is an allegory to addressing it.
Yeah, in a fascinating story. Thank you. Rory Wheeler is next.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for coming or being on the speaker series tonight. My name is Rory Wheeler. I am a senior at Niagara, and I'm a citizen of the Seneca Nation. I'm actually familiar with your territory on my dad's side. I hail from the Walla Walla, up on the Umatilla Indian Reservation, Oregon, and Nez Perce as well. I have a lot of friends up in Colville and Yakima and Coeur d'Alene, so it's good to be on with you tonight. I think my question would be posed to the other students that might be joining this evening. With Native American Heritage Month coming up, and what do you think is your best advice for non-Native students or even non-Native, non-Indigenous people in general to be best allies to Indigenous people?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot. I think, there's a very big learning curve that non-Native people have to go through. And one of the things is, they need to understand that not only do we still exist, but that we have these knowledge systems that are critical to any kind of conversation about sustainability, and that Native people still have claims to those lands, to the lands that they have been dispossessed of. So how do you support Native peoples? What do you know about the Native peoples on the land that you're living on? Do you know who those people are in, wherever it is that you call home? And this is something I work with my students in this TEK class that I teach. I get them to think about this by asking them at the beginning of the semester. I ask them, what is your relationship to land and place and to the indigenous peoples of that place? And, of course, nobody's ever been asked that question. They've never had to think about it. And, most of them don't even know who the indigenous peoples are of the land they're living on. But what I want to get them to think about is understanding that for tens of thousands of years, the land that they live on was occupied and tended by people that had a very different relationship to land, a relationship that was sustainable, that was intelligent, that was respectful, that was based on an equitable relationship, a relationship of respect, of reciprocity, and responsibility. And getting back to what I said earlier about how this is a philosophical problem, this is why Indigenous knowledge is so critical, because it has the ability to change the way we think and our approach to living on land. And that's transformation. That's the kind of transformation I'm trying to bring in my students, because transformation has to happen on all levels, not just at the institutional level, but it has to happen at the individual level. You can't have institutional level transformation without individual transformation, and vice versa. So that's paradigm shift. That's what we're talking about. And that's really what we need. If we want to have a future for our grandchildren, we need to have a different relationship to land and our environment.
A wonderful answer. And I'm going to now promote Jordan Kawaya, who asked a couple of questions that relate to what you just said, but maybe probes it a little more specifically with regard to animals and plants. So Jordan.
Hello. So I had a question. I kind of wrote it down, but I think it disappeared. Is there a way, Dave, do you still have that question on your end?
I see it.
Okay.
But what would you say if someone argued that the argument is anthropocentric and it seems to be more of an argument about land possession? You mentioned land ethic, but it seems to leave out animals. Does your argument leave out animals and plants? No, it doesn't. When I say land, it's inclusive of all the life that exists on the land. So it's not just ground and dirt, it's everything, it's ecosystems, right? And that includes everything within it, because in an Indigenous worldview, everything is seen as a relative. That's what a relational worldview is. Native people are not anthropocentric, and that's the difference. Native peoples don't place themselves at the center. They see themselves as only one element of the world of beings that exist. And so that's why it's so important, because and this narrative of anthropocentrism and the Anthropocene is really problematic for Indigenous people, because as Kyle White, who's one of the most well-respected Indigenous scholars around environmental issues and Indigenous knowledge, has written about, that the concept of the Anthropocene really doesn't apply to us, because we're not the ones that started these problems. Right? The problem of the Anthropocene starts with European invasion, at least on this continent. It starts with European invasion and the imposition of technologies, not our own, that are what are responsible for the massive environmental degradation that we're dealing with now. So you cannot separate this idea of the Anthropocene from the history of colonization, right? It's not just capitalism, it's colonization and capitalism together. And that was imposed on us.
Then I had one more question. I said, we speak about wildness and not tainting our environment wildness. it seems to be that American Indians have been added to that wildness, and not only speaking about animals and not tainting their wildness, but also not tainting American Indian, not tainting American Indians. Is your argument that we cannot speak about environmental justice on plants and animals and other clear environmental issues without including Native people?
Yeah, I don't know what you mean by American Indian wildness, but this concept of wildness is always constructed around the idea that wild spaces don't include humans, right? And that's how we get the concept of wilderness, without recognizing that these supposed wilderness spaces, there was nowhere in this continent that wasn't occupied by humans, that wasn't used by humans. And this is one of the fallacies of the concept of wilderness. Now, granted, things have changed. And now there's 300 million people who live on the continent. And so that's a big difference compared to the 18 million people that lived here in 1492. So now there's a reason, there's good reason to talk about conservation and protecting places. But whenever you talk about conservation, that's a slippery slope, because not just here in the US, where Native people have been kicked off their lands in order to create wilderness, right? The same thing is happening worldwide. In the conservation world, in every continent, Indigenous peoples are being pushed off their lands in order to protect these so-called wild spaces. That's a whole other conversation, but this is the danger of thinking about conservation and wilderness as unpeopled landscapes. So it's really, from my perspective, it's really more about how do we understand ourselves as part of landscapes, but in ways that are not destructive of landscapes.
So another issue that I wanted to highlight is we had an Allegheny counselor on. I don't know if he's still on, Stephen Gordon, who mentioned that he believes our younger generation will be inspired by your guidance and passion. And thank you for your words. Our next question is directed to Jose Antonio Gomez, or is coming from, I should say, Jose Antonio.
Hello. So thanks for coming and talking. My question is, like, after hearing about ecocide and environmental racism, what is the reason you think that this information is suppressed in the American education system?
Because Americans are not comfortable. It doesn't fit the American master narrative, the American exceptionalist master narratives of the US as this beacon of democracy and justice and rights. It doesn't match. The reality of this country's history is that it was founded on genocide and land theft. But we have this kind of discourse and this other narrative where that's very present right now, where we're talking about the original sin of the United States, and that original sin is said to be slavery, right? So we're completely evading this history of invasion and violent genocide. How is that not the original sin, right? Certainly, at least a twin aspect of slavery. They went hand in hand. But my argument is that you don't have transatlantic slave trade on this continent without invasion and genocide. So this is what I'm taking on in my next book. I'm getting to the heart of all of this in the next book, is like understanding what I call the colonial unspeakable. And that unspeakability is the complete avoidance and evasion of the actual history of this country, and how it's never been accounted for.
And that ties right into the next question from Joe Tricarico. You're muted, Joe.
Hi, thanks for coming on. It's been awesome listening to the discussion. So my question is kind of like, how do you kind of respond to somebody maybe who's trying to like talk about these things and like argue against, you know, this kind of, you know, almost the new American culture, or not the new American culture, but like the American culture that's like kind of like materialistic and like going against the environment and infringing on these things, but also, you know, feels like they're being hypocritical because they're taking advantage of all the fruits of the of that culture, like, you know, living, like, you know, buying things from the factories and stuff like that, you know, Nike, whatever, that uses like oil from the land or like electricity and stuff like that in houses and whatnot.
I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. Like, can you?
So somebody who's, you know, trying to argue against this stuff, but they feel like they might feel hypocritical about arguing against, you know, the American, like America, like as the country, like, and the companies specifically. But like, you know, like Trump trying to get like oil in Alaska, there's a bunch of native reserves up there where they're trying to take over the land and like through eminent domain and get like the oil and stuff like that. So how would you respond to somebody who's maybe trying to argue against stuff like that, but also doesn't want to stop enjoying the fruits of the labor, like feels like a hypocrite because they don't want to avoid the, you know, fruits of that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, and that's why you cannot separate this history of colonialism from capitalism, right? These conversations go hand in hand. So we have to interrogate capitalism, extractive capitalism, because extractive capitalism always involves genocide. It has from the very beginning, and it continues. The Gwich'in people in Anwar, where they're trying to open up to drilling, this is genocidal for the Gwich'in. That 200,000, you know, big herd of the caribou, they call it the porcupine caribou herd. That's what's endangered up there. So, you know, understanding that the human rights abuses, I mean, I don't know, I don't have a simple answer to that question, right? But understanding the framework of it, that, you know, the protecting, in very many cases, the protection of environments also involves the protection of Indigenous rights. That's true globally. Now, it's not true straight across the board because there are Indigenous people who are engaging in extractive industries, and that's a problem, right? But that's a matter of sovereignty. And that's because, you know, you're thinking, you talk about, you know, people like the Fort Berthold Reservation up there in the Bakken oil fields. They were the poorest of the poor. They were among the poorest of the poor until the oil boom there, right? So you know, these are, I write about this in the book, and I call it a Faustian bargain that tribes sometimes are forced to make in order to be able to ensure their survival and a way out of this grinding poverty. So capitalism forces these horrible choices on Native people. So, you know, this kind of like underneath all of this is like not thinking of this, kind of avoiding the idea or the conversation of Native people as the ultimate environmentalists. That's a trope, that's a stereotype. But for the most part, it's even with those tribes in their knowledge systems, they still have that, and that, you know, that respect for the land. And they don't, you know, the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara, those people at Fort Berthold, they're paying the price. Their lands are so polluted and so contaminated that, you know, they're dealing with it now, and there are places on the reservation that will take generations to heal. But ultimately, the you know, the connecting Indigenous, you know, the protection of environments with is deeply connected to the protection of Indigenous rights.
Wonderful answer to a complicated question. Jordan Goodwin, you're up.
Hi, I just had a question. I was wondering, what is the legality right now of Indigenous nations doing controlled fires? Or do they have the right to do so? And have you personally ever seen or participated in one of the controlled fires?
That's a great question. I never have. I've been invited to. I was going to actually this year because there are places like UC Davis here in Northern California has, they're one of the very few PhD programs in Native American studies. And they're really strong on teaching these kinds of topics like Indigenous, centered land practices, land management practices. They have a whole course on controlled burning and fire ecology. And I was up there in January giving a talk, and I was invited to come back in March to participate and observe that. And then COVID happened. So I was robbed of that opportunity, but I hope to at some point. But yes, these practices are still alive. They are now being turned to, like you saw in that video, there's more attention being paid to those Indigenous land management practices and controlled burning, and they are being incorporated in pockets. And I don't know the extent to which that's happening, but I keep learning more and more about how that's happening.
Lori, do you want to jump in?
Sure. For the students who actually want to possibly see a controlled burning more locally here in New York State, Ganondagan, which is in Victor, New York, south of Rochester, it's a state historic site. And it's really what we would consider the birthplace of Tecumseh, who in history is the first woman to accept the peacemakers, story of peace and whatnot. But they do a controlled burn there almost every year. And it is an Indigenous practice. And I would highly encourage, groups of students to get together with your faculty because Ganondagan does invite and welcome groups, especially those who want to study about the ecology of this region from an Indigenous perspective. And also, they do this burn of fields there on an annual basis. And they've got the entire community involved in it because it is something that people just didn't even realize that we had done, time immemorial before, settlers even came to this region. So there are local things like that you can learn about and see and witness.
We have been planning a trip to Ganondagan. Actually, Catherine Spencer, a Native student who's on tonight, was arranging that for us, and unfortunately, COVID stopped us from that experience as well. So, all right, let's ask one more question. This is from an anonymous attendee, and the magic of Zoom is that people can answer questions while in their pajamas and not be put on the spot. So I'll let that part of it go, and I'll ask the question on their behalf, which just disappeared. So now I lost it. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, here it is. Is traditional Indigenous knowledge at all reconcilable with Euro-Western epistemology, aka Western science, or are they fundamentally irreconcilable? Could the two be put into conversation, or are they irretrievably at odds? So with that easy question, we'll end on that.
That's a great question, and I think that's something that that they're trying, but the two sides are trying to work out. I think that they are. I have a lot I can say about that because I've worked on projects that involved this. In fact, I'm working on one right now too. That involves the coming together of Western science and traditional knowledge. I think that more and more Western science is recognizing that it doesn't have all the answers and that it doesn't have the frameworks for understanding, for a broader understanding, a deeper understanding our relationship, the human relationship to the natural world. And so they are looking to Indigenous knowledge. It's showing up more and more in the literature, and in on the ground land management practices like cultural burning, like we've seen. The problem that I've seen firsthand is that Western science still has a propensity to imagine itself as superior. Like there's a hubris about it, where science, believes that it alone possesses the most important knowledge, and the most like useful knowledge, or the best knowledge, and that it's just superior. But I think what they're starting to find out is that they don't. I think it's humbling. It's a humbling experience for a lot of scientists, and a lot of scientists aren't there. They're not willing to acknowledge that Indigenous knowledge is a thing, and native science, as Greg Gahete, so famously wrote about, is real, and that it has something of value to contribute, and that, like she said in that video, you can't ignore thousands-year-old data sets. Like that's where Western science hasn't gotten to yet, but I think they're trying. And so I think that they can work together harmoniously. That's what it looks like to me. But Western science has to shed its hubris about it.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the talk tonight and your book as well really are both incredibly eye-opening and give us a lot to think about and a lot to consider in terms of what we know, what we don't know, new ways of integrating knowledge, and really thinking about how we can be more open and aware of the world around us, and our responsibility, and the role that we have played in oppressive histories, and how those continue to linger into the present and into the future. So Dina, Gilio-Whitaker, thank you so much for your presentation. A really wonderful compliment to our Transformative Visions speaker series. Thank you to Dr. Quigley for the introduction. Thank you to all of the great questions from our audience, and we're looking forward to your next book. And when COVID is past and we have an opportunity to bring people to campus, we hope that you'll take the opportunity to come visit us and do a presentation in person.
I would love that.
Wonderful.
Thank
you so much. Thank you
Okay.
for the wonderful presentation. Have a wonderful night.
Everybody.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Take care.